Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our 12th podcast. Today, I am joined by my good friend Noah. If you'd like to say hi, Noah.
Hey guys, glad to be back.
And today we're going to be talking about the Spirit of Fire, which is the main ship that we see in Halo Wars and Halo Wars 2. And going on with that ship, I think we should start with its history before we're actually introduced to it in the game Halo Wars. And Noah, if you would like to take off with that.
Yeah, so the Spirit of Fire, which is an amazing name for a ship, by the way, something that's kind of seen throughout all of Halo. Halo ship names are just amazing, including this one. And so this type of ship was a Phoenix-class support vessel. This was a modified colony ship that was intended to transport colonists and sort of terraform different areas. It was constructed initially in 2473, and its designation is CFV-88. It is very capable of providing orbital support for planetary forces as a retrofitted military ship. And of course, as you see with the gameplay of Halo Wars, you're able to establish forward operating bases and quickly get troops on the ground and vehicles on the ground as well. So it was really interesting to see this type of vehicle in play, just due to the fact that, as we know, the war with the Covenant in space was not going very well. So we see the UNSC trying to make up for that by taking in these different ships and changing them up so that they were able to get numbers out there, while also being able to, because as we've discussed a few times, the UNSC was a lot better on the ground in most places. So it's really interesting to see that theory within the ship. And this ship was actually capable of holding 11,350 total personnel, and then, of course, numerous different vehicles and different tools and weapons. So, speaking of the crew, why don't you tell us a little bit about them?
So, starting off with the crew, I can think of none other than with the captain, Captain James Cutter. He joined the Naval Service on November 16, 2507, as a lieutenant, as a junior navigation officer aboard a ship called the Stick. He actually served on two other vessels during his career before finally given the option to command his own ship, the Spirit of Fire, and he is the captain that we see all the way through Halo Wars and Halo Wars 2. Now, he has a lot of experience and was actually handpicked by Vice Admiral Preston Cole during the time and has served already a number of years above this. As we can see, he was actually there during the time of Contact Harvest, which was the initial contact of the humans and the Covenant on the planet Harvest. And when we're introduced to him in Halo Wars, it is actually 5 years after the loss of Harvest in 2526. Moving on to what I like to consider his first officer, John Forge. John Forge was born on Earth on May 29th, 2501, and his entire life he revolved it around the military. His family lineage had been part of the military for generations, dating as far back as World War II, and he actually had a daughter who we'll talk about later, Lucy Orion or Ryan Forge, in 2525, which is right before Contact Harvest and when that starts. He immediately went into service at the age of 16 and was actually arrested twice during his service. His first arrest was for directly disobeying orders, and his second was for an assault on an officer with some sort of confrontation, which we'll get into here a little bit later. That's kind of expanded on when we talk about his daughter, Ryan. The last person I'd like to talk about is Professor Ellen Anders. She was actually born in the colony of Arcadia and was studying under Dr. Catherine Halsey. Even though the relationship was tense, she learned a lot and actually started in theoretical xenobiology at Richard University. During this time, Oni was showing her the idea of a treasure world and Harvest, and this actually piqued Anders' interest because the Covenant, after taking Harvest, seemed to be very interested in the Northern Pole, and Oni intercepted snippets of communications and pictures to show that they were looking for something. So obviously, with Anders' interest piqued, she immediately jumped on the Spirit of Fire and sort of begins our story with what happens at the beginning of Halo Wars 1, if we know you kind of want to start going back into that.
Yeah, so Halo Wars 1, the first, is of course our first, or our furthest back in the timeline in comparison to CE itself. So, as we know, the game takes place in the year 2531, which is 5 years after the loss of Harvest. And, of course, as we know, Contact Harvest itself was in 2525. So, of course, we get the introduction cutscene telling us how it took 5 long years to take Harvest back, and that's where we pick up with that the Harvest was under attack by Covenant forces again. And so, with that, we end up seeing that there was some interesting activity going on, and which calls for Cutter to send Forge to retake this. And of course, he encounters Covenant excavation crews who are about to destroy this facility. And eventually, the troops are defeated, and Anders herself decides to investigate the facility. Here, she discovers that this place was actually an interstellar map that had different set of coordinates on it, which actually ended up pointing to Arcadia. And so the Spirit of Fire travels to Arcadia to investigate this signal, where they discover that the Covenant had already been sieging this area, and this leads them into contact with Red Team, which is a wonderful new Spartan team, if you want to tell us about them.
Yeah, so Red Team is another Spartan team similar to Blue Team. They were part of also the Orion 2 project, which is considered the Spartan 2 project. And when we meet them in 2531, they are at a very young age, actually the age that you would see similar to if you've ever watched Halo Forward Unto Dawn, where Chief and some other members of Blue Team are there. So they are very young at the time when you meet them. However, just like in normal fashion as we've always seen them, they are still Spartans and stand head over shoulders than everyone else. With Red Team, the Spirit of Fire defend the colony of Arcadia from the Covenant siege, and actually notice that they are shielding or that the Covenant is putting up a shield to hide something. They seem to be interested in something, however, they are unable to see it. Within this, they actually also are on the planet of Arcadia with a few other ships that are the Pillar of Autumn and the Armstrong. Now, the Pillar of Autumn is the ship that we also see originally at the very beginning of Halo Combat Evolved, and on this ship, even though it is damaged, they actually have to recall a plasma-based Rhino. And if you've ever played Halo Wars, you would know that the Rhinos are a kind of a mixture of a tank and a wraith, sort of like a it still shoots like a mortar, but it's still the same way. And with this, they're able to go through Covenant shielding without destroying what is ever underneath it that shooting a Mac round or any sort of archer pod bombardment would cause on the planet. Once they do this, Sergeant Forge and Professor Anders head down onto the planet to see what the Covenant were investigating, and unfortunately, Anders is captured by an elite, which was the Arbiter. Of that time, I should say. His name was Ripamormi, and Ripamormi was a massive elite, much bigger, again, just like the Spartans, head over shoulders than other elites. And with this, they immediately, or at least the Arbiter, takes Anders and immediately jumps to slip space in a certain direction. Now, the Spirit of Fire is currently tasked with helping with the evacuation of Arcadia. However, with the loss of Anders, or at least with Anders being stolen, something called the Cole Protocol comes into play. Now, for those of you who have read the book, The Cole Protocol, you'll know what I'm talking about. But for those of you who've only kind of heard of it, like in the initial cutscene of Halo CE, I'm going to kind of explain really quick. The Cole Protocol is something that was enacted very early on in the Human Covenant War that was set in place to prevent the Covenant from being able to trace humanity back towards the inner colonies and, most importantly, Earth. Now, in order to do this, what humanity or what the UNSC would have to do is take control over all navigational data that was on any sort of ship that had slip space capabilities and pretty much destroy it or have control over it and set protocols in place that if the Covenant were ever to come on, the first things that would need to be destroyed were those things. Now, Professor Anders, even though she is only a civilian when we meet her, and actually is a civilian throughout the entire time, she is not military, is still a huge breach in protocol, and therefore the Spirit of Fire has to make the decision to leave a log buoy, which we will come back to later, that was never actually recovered due to an incident with Lord Hood, of which he mentions in Halo Escalation that he neglected to do and sort of out of spite did not follow orders. So the Spirit of Fire chases this Covenant ship to whatever location it's going to via slip space and leaves this log buoy behind that no one picks up for a very long period of time, which we will come back to later in this podcast. And they arrive at a shield world known as Etrin Harbridge. And from there, we actually meet an enemy that at least I did not expect to meet when I first played this game. Noah, if you kind of wanted to go on to at least the introduction of what maybe your first thoughts you had at least, and then you can pass it back to me. When you met this kind of unknown enemy, at least this early on in the or at least in the Halo universe.
Yeah, so the Halo fans would have been able to immediately recognize the sight of a more insidious enemy that we see right when the Spirit of Fire enters this area, which is, of course, the Flood. Which, being able to understand the timeline of things and knowing that this takes place prior to CE, you can understand how, more prepared Halo fans would understand that this is a very telling sign. And, you said it yourself, you were able to understand that Spirit of Fire is not really going to make it back because of this.
And yeah, that's something I really wanted to mention as well, that you were saying we've had personal conversations before where as soon as I saw the Flood introduced in Halo Wars, at least on this world, Etrin Harbridge, any experienced Halo players that were familiar with the lore and extended lore know that the first sign that humanity ever received of the Flood, of their existence, was after the Battle of Installation 04, which are the events that take place in Halo Combat Evolved. And Chief's report, or Dr. Halsey's report that she gives to Chief, to give to Oni and the UNSC of the Flood after the events in the book known as First Strike. So within seeing this, we immediately know that whatever's happening with the Spirit of Fire, either they will not make it home or they're not going to live through the events that happen at all. There might be some self-sacrifice, which we're actually going to continue going on to here. So after Anders is captured and the Spirit of Fire arrives at the world Etrin Harbridge, they enter inside the Shield world, and we kind of jump to a part where we're introduced to a Forerunner armada, I should say, of ships that have been left behind for humanity to reclaim, as is the goal of all Forerunner technology, or at least the goal of humanity as the Reclaimers, to reclaim and inherit all the Forerunner technology. Unbeknownst to many of the Covenant, and discussed further in reasoning why it goes this way in the book Contact Harvest, the Covenant can't necessarily or easily activate human, or Forerunner technology, I should say. It requires a more human touch, if you've ever heard the monitor from Halo 5 kind of give that line. And so the reasoning for capturing Anders is explained here, and Ripamorami brings Anders to the Prophet of Regret. Again, if you read the book Contact Harvest, you'll understand why Regret is here on his own and why there are no other prophets around at this time. And what we see is that the prophet is concerned that with the destruction of humanity, and at least his hatred for the destruction of humanity, that using the ships that he have will not be enough in order to eradicate all of humanity without leaving them defenseless, which is something I'll probably come back to here in a little bit and discuss why maybe that was so, even though you and I both know, and for many extended lore fans, as well as, seen in things like Halo Legends, we know that the Covenant in their numbers just absolutely decimated and outnumbered all of humanity. But yet, the Prophet of Regret is still concerned with this, and so what ends up happening is the Prophet of Regret is eventually evacuated from Etrin Harbridge, and the Arbiter at the time, Ripamorami, actually uses Professor Anders and her human touch in order to activate this Covenant Armada, and that kind of is going to bring us to the end of the story here with the final chapter and what happens. If Noah, if you'd like to finish that up.
Yeah, so right after these ships are activated, this is the point in which you can really tell that Halo Wars is not just some simple side quest. This is something very serious because the stakes have been raised. And so right after these ships have been activated, Anders is actually able to escape through a teleportation device, and she's later rescued. And so once Cutter understands the stakes and what they're dealing with, he decides that the best plan of action is to destroy this fleet instead of allowing the Covenant to use it, because that would probably mean the end of the war. So he develops a plan to detonate the ship's FTL drive, or faster than light, in the planet's sun that was on the interior. And this would actually end up causing a supernova, which would destroy all of the ships present. So, as they're preparing this reactor, Forge and Red Team are actually ambushed by the Arbiter and his elites, which leads us to one of the best cutscenes across just about everything, don't you think?
Oh yeah, the Monsters cutscene, if you guys have not seen Halo Wars, and if you guys don't plan on playing it, I do recommend just at least watching the cutscenes for maybe getting a general idea of what goes down in the game. You might miss some little things here and there, but the cutscenes are nice to watch. They are unfortunately not done by Blur Studios, like we'll talk about here with Halo Wars 2, but are still done very well by Creative Assembly and are just absolutely amazing. In fact, the Monsters cutscene from Halo Wars 1 is my absolute all-time favorite Halo's cutscene because it just shows the absolute amazing, just kick-ass nature of the Spartans, as well as the nature of John Forge and his ability to take on the Arbiter. If you would like to entail, Noah, how that fight goes down.
Yeah, and just speaking of that fight, it's a really, really good fight that sets Forge up as this amazing character because not only is he able to defeat the Arbiter, but he's able to do it in close combat, which is ridiculous if you ask me, just because that shows how amazing he is as a fighter. What he actually is able to do is play against the fact that he knows that the Arbiter is a cocky son of a bitch, right? So he uses that against him, and whenever the Arbiter thinks he's won and he has the upper hand, he turns the fight around and kills the Arbiter. And it's a great moment, and it's a great thing for Forge's character. But
Unfortunately,
after
at
this,
the oh, sorry, you're good to go.
yeah, no, but yeah. So after that fight, we learn that this drive needs to be manually detonated. So, unfortunately, like you were saying, Forge has to do this himself. And I think it's a really cool moment for Forge as well that he decides, you know what, we're going to need as many Spartans as we can. So he sends Red Team back. And so we also get to see that, mutual respect that Forge commanded between him and Red Team, which is really nice. And that's just another thing is he was able to not only defeat the Arbiter but command the respect of Spartans. So that really puts him in a league of his own, really, like with Sergeant Johnson, maybe.
Oh yeah, definitely. To not have the augmentations or the training that the Spartans have yet, to be able to have a Spartan say, knowing that you are falling down a path of, I would say a last stand or a self-sacrifice, to say that it's been an honor is definitely probably one of the highest regards you can receive in the Halo universe. From an emotion, I would say like an emotionless crew like the Spartan 2s. Finishing up now with the Halo Wars, obviously, as we know, Sergeant Forge will sacrifice himself with the Shao Fujikawa slipspace drive in the core of the sun, and the Spirit of Fire, as a last move, actually pulls a slingshot around the sun that is in the core of the planet Etrin Harbridge to project themselves out at a speed of which they will be able to escape the terminal velocity of the world as the gravity of the sun is actually expanding due to it going supernova. Now, again, I know I said a lot of big words there, but for the science guys out there, you'll know exactly what I was talking about. They slingshot around in order to give themselves enough speed to leave the atmosphere, in short. And this kind of leaves them out in the middle of nowhere with no ability to go home other than just, the inertia that they're flying through space on and no FTL drive to be able to jump into slip space with. And from there, we would originally go into Halo Wars 2. However, there are some other extended media that we know of, Noah, and some books that we enjoyed. If you wanted to start talking about, a quick summary of those books.
Yeah, so we were actually given I'm not sure what the trilogy itself is called, but it details the experiences of one Ryan Forge, who, of course, is related to the beloved John Forge. And now we get to see her crew itself go through with the adventures of Smoke and Shadow and Renegades, which are two fantastic books that do an amazing job of expanding the lore of Halo in different ways that you really wouldn't have even thought about, potentially. And both books are just filled to the brim with world building that just really fleshes out Halo itself. Some of the examples would be an encounter with two Megalekulu on an abandoned, or what's thought to be an abandoned ship, and all throughout the encounter, it's set up as these two creatures, and potentially even more, are things you don't want to mess around with. Because one of the crew of the Ace of Spades was actually an ex-UNSC Marine, and so he's hearing his descriptions of the fact that, hunters are these intimidating things, and, what we've always assumed from gameplay, but we never really hear someone else's perspective on this enemy, was just fantastic. And then the encounter itself is also wonderful, so I'd recommend you pick up the book for that. But essentially, throughout this book, since the Ace of Spades crew is a bunch of scavengers, they were given a job that would potentially set them up for the rest of their lives. But this instead leads them to the UNSC Roman Blue, which where there they find some information that would lead them on a hunt for what Ryan wants the most, which is to find the Spirit of Fire, because she never really truly believed that it's just gone the way it was listed within the UNSC. So this sets them off on a journey across a vast amount of places that would lead them to just finding these different clues and hunting for different things. And eventually in Renegades, we actually meet up with a familiar character.
So going on from there, like you're saying, the familiar character, after finding things like the log buoy I mentioned earlier from the crashed ship, the Roman Blue, which was the salvage that was supposed to set them up for life, and even visiting the wreckage of Etrin Harbridge, eventually the crew of the Ace of Spades and Ryan Forge, the daughter again of John Forge, end up running into issues with ONI or ONI, which are the Office of Naval Intelligence, who are kind of the boogeyman of the Halo universe, and have everything taken from them, but are able to obtain some information of a crashed ship known as the Rubicon. For any of those who have read the Forerunner trilogy, you'll actually know this ship, and attempt to salvage what they can. From there, they actually pick up an armature, unknowing who it is at the time. However, for anyone, again, who had read the Forerunner trilogy would know that it is actually none other than 343 Guilty Spark in a new body. From there, the crew of the Ace of Spades and Spark could go through the rest of their journey, of which I'm not going to spoil now. Again, we definitely recommend you pick up these books just for the amount of lore expansion and in-depth into the civilian side, or even outside of the UNSC perspective of the Halo universe, and what happens and what it's like to deal with Oni from a civilian perspective. For those of you who are interested and want to know a little bit more about Spark, I actually did a YouTube video based on the idea that Spark might be looking for mendicant bias. For any of you guys who are extended lore or deep lore Halo fans, feel free to check that video out. It's on my YouTube channel. I'll leave the link in the description below. But they finished that up, and from what we know, they are supposed to have one more book come out before Infinite, which is supposed to be, I guess, the Spark Redemption book that kind of entails what this is. And so, to kind of quickly put things in perspective, these two books, Halo Smoke and Shadow and Halo Renegades, take place between Halo 3 and Halo 4. They take place just a couple of months before the events of Halo 4. And within the books, we kind of hear of some of the events that are going to be happening in the future, or events that have happened in Halo 4, which, again, I don't want to spoil for you guys and let you kind of draw those links for yourselves. But at the end of those, at least, dealing with the Spirit of Fire, or people related to some of the crew of the Spirit of Fire, we finally end up back at pretty much the furthest game along in the Halo timeline that we've seen thus far, which is Halo Wars 2. Noah, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, so of course, like you were saying, it takes place after the events of Halo 5, so yeah, this is definitely the most recent in the timeline. And so we pick up right where we left off, almost, with the Spirit of Fire adrift, but we see that Serena has undergone rampancy, of course, just due to the nature of how long she's been alive, so she has been officially terminated, and that's the touching cutscene we get at the beginning, which is pretty well done. And speaking of...
Don't mean to interrupt,
yeah.
but I actually forgot to mention the quick story that is... this Captain Something Has Happened. For anyone who played the end of Halo Wars on Legendary, you'll hear the quick snippet or the audio that is Serena saying Captain Something Has Happened, which eventually in the graphic novel Tales from Slipspace, there is a short story that entails a flood parasite actually that was snuck aboard on the ship and infected a number of crew members, to which Jerome from Spartan Red Team had to contain on his own, and Professor Andrews actually was even woken up as well to help kind of contain, and Serena studied this. However, Serena's dispensation, due to her rampancy, was a subject that was mentioned then, and from what you had just said right now, kind of reminds me, that's what leads into the introduction of Halo Wars 2, of which, feel free to continue going on now, but I totally forgot about that piece of Halo media that was in there that kind of showed the reason why Captain Something Has Happened. She had made multiple messages, pre-recorded messages that were made for possible protocols that would happen when the crew awoke from cryosleep after the end of Halo Wars 1. But there were some changes actually with Halo Wars 2, kind of with the actors and the new studio that was doing the cutscenes.
Yeah, so right away you'll be able to notice those. As you can tell, these cutscenes are done by Blur Studios, who's actually responsible for the amazing cutscenes we got in the Halo 2 Anniversary remaster that's available on the Master Chief Collection. These are some of the most beautiful cutscenes across any video game ever. They're so well done. They have amazing facial animations, and a lot of that is due to the fact that they use some really good mocap technology or motion capture. And so this requires having physical actors, of course. And so what you can see is that the appearances of a lot of our tried and true characters have changed, and their voices are also different as well, just because they now represent real people and real actors. And so this was done just in order to give us that more realistic Blur touch, which, in my opinion, paid off. I know a lot of people were kind of iffy about it, but I think watching the final product, which, again, if you're not going to play this game, if you're not particularly interested in RTS, again, I would recommend checking out those cutscenes and watching them because they are really well done, and you'll definitely enjoy it if you're a Halo fan. And like we've been talking about, you can actually tell that these games are actually really deep in the lore, and they actually have a lot of extensive ramifications on the rest of the galaxy, which we'll get to soon. Don't mean to jump too far ahead, but essentially we end up meeting the crew of the Spirit of Fire again, and we see that they have been pulled through slip space. I know you kind of did a little theory on that portion.
Basing again my theory that I was mentioning earlier, one of the big things is that the crew of the Spirit of Fire at the beginning of Halo Wars 2 is pulled through slip space, and even as we mentioned in this podcast, the Spirit of Fire does not currently have its FTL or slip space drive or its Shao Fujikawa slip space drive, which would mean that some external force pulled them to the location which they're at, which is a location that we are quite familiar with for any of those who have played Halo 3, which is the Lesser Ark. And when we get there to the Lesser Ark, kind of starting on the story now of Halo Wars 2, we actually meet a character known as Isabel, who is a logistics AI and had been there on the outpost of the Ark. Now, for those of you who also have played Halo 3 and remember, there is a portal from Earth to the Ark. However, at the beginning of this game, that portal's been closed, and from there we meet a very new enemy, unlike anything we had met in the Halo universe before, in especially the contrary to what we would expect from someone like him. And Noah, if you wanted to start talking about him.
Yeah, so we get our first encounter with Atriox, who is an intimidating and cunning villain for the Halo universe. And our first encounter with him really shows that because he's able to handily defeat Red Team in combat without really even breaking a sweat. There was very little effort into it. In fact, I believe during that confrontation, he was really just trying to test these, because I feel like he wasn't entirely familiar with Spartan capabilities. So he wanted to see that, and you can kind of see that when he says, you're just a man. And so he just easily defeats these 3 super soldiers in combat, and he just almost destroys Douglas. And he was able to easily just shatter a Mjolnir helmet within his hand. And so with this, encounter, you can tell right off the bat that Atriox is not someone you want to mess around with. And the Banished themselves, which is this new army, is also very interesting if you want to elaborate on the Banished.
So, The Banished, for anybody who, I guess, originally had read the Halo Escalation comic books by Dark Horse, which I had also mentioned a little bit previous in this video, were a series of comics that were made kind of after the time of Halo 4 Spartan Ops, and within that we were introduced to the Banished, with Atriox obviously as a leader. Now, the Banished, who are what I would like to believe is the reason, as I was mentioning again earlier in this podcast, where why Regret was so scared to use the forces that he currently had to attack humanity, saying that, and leaving us defenseless, because when we are introduced to the Banished by Isabel, the Banished are the only enemy that the Covenant have known that were able to withstand the Covenant at their full power. And as we can see, even the art style and the amazing, again, cutscenes that we see throughout Halo Wars 2 represent something that I mentioned in another YouTube video of mine that I made, which was the return of the old Bungie art style of the Covenant, which is what the Banished look like, but with maybe a new color scheme and a few more brute-like attachments on many of their vehicles and armor, because the Banished in itself is actually a compilation of old Covenant forces, as well as the mixture of brutes, as well as some elites that are now working as mercenaries and even have their own Covenant ships and whatnot, which is what we see in Halo Wars, and will lead us to probably one of the big events that happens within Halo Wars, at least my favorite cutscene within Halo Wars 2, if you wanted to talk on that.
Yeah, so after a few, sort of skirmishes and encounters with the Banished, we are led to understand that Atriox is in control of the Ark's portal network, which allows him to kind of transport his forces across the installation, which is very bad for the UNSC, of course. And so eventually the Spirit of Fire crew kind of strikes out and ends up killing Atriox's second, who was Decimus, which is a pretty decent little boss fight that you get to play out. And this victory itself was rather short-lived because, as we can see, the Banished actually have a carrier above known as the Enduring Conviction. And so while the Spirit of Fire is engaged in this space battle in a really cool cutscene, as you were saying, we actually see that an attempt to destroy it is made. And so this is done by, kind of triggering the Sentinel Defense Forces and encouraging them to attack the Enduring Conviction. And eventually they're actually able to split the ship in two. And so this really angers Atriox, and you can see it in his reaction to the destroyed ship and his discussion with, the shipmaster that, you need to make sure you're worth it. And so right after this, we see that eventually we see, however, that Anders is able to create a plan in a way to sort of create, since this is the Ark and it's the area where new Halos are created, she decides the best plan of action would be to create a Halo without its firing mechanism, which is actually really important going forward. And so here, as she takes control of this Halo, we are treated to the final mission of the game, which is essentially defending Anders as she's in the control room to deploy, the communications beacon and deploy the ring itself while disabling the firing systems. We see that Atriox's forces have, surrounded the area and retreated to this last stand, which is, of course, one of the best missions. I thought it was probably the best mission in both of the Halo Wars games, just because you had to, manage all your units in different areas and, have different counter units in different spots while also, eventually holding off some of the most intimidating Banished units like the Blisterbacks and then the Scarab eventually, while also taking control of the, Condor super unit, which was fun. And during that time, of course, the Spirit of Fire crew is able to hold their ground long enough for the ring to fire, which sets them off and prevents the Banished from taking control of this ring. And so essentially at the end of Halo Wars 2, we see that the fight isn't over. Atriox still has plenty of units at his disposal, and in fact, he's probably prepping the war machine, while Cutter understands that their job isn't done. They need to hold off Atriox or do whatever they can to hinder his operations within the Ark, because the Ark is a crucial area within the Halo universe. And so after that ending, if you play on Legendary, you get some really important and juicy information if you want to tell us about that.
Yeah, so the ending that we see for Halo Wars 2 is, as you were saying a little bit ago, Professor Anders, who was on the recently finished Halo Ring Installation 04C, or Installation 09. And now, the reason why I started with Installation 04C is due to the nature of where this ring is going. What Anders explains to Captain Cutter is that The Halo rings are only able to travel via slipspace to one of the locations of where the rings were originally meant to go. Now, if you remember, as I mentioned a few times in this podcast, the original Halo game, Halo Combat Evolved, took place very close to the planet Reach, which is where the Pillar of Autumn found the original Installation 04, Installation 04A, and the event, the Battle of Installation 04 went down. So the plan at the end of Halo Wars 2 was for Professor Anders to jump to the area or the location outside of Reach, which was where Installation 04A originally was, on this newly finished installation, and send a distress beacon that will let the rest of the UNSC know that the Spirit of Fire is still there, where the Ark is, and how to get to them for help. What unfortunately happens is, for some reason, the ring is stopped midway through, and Professor Anders goes to investigate, seeing a Guardian. Now, you and I both know that this game takes place about a couple months after Halo, the end of Halo 5 in 2559, with Halo 5 mainly taking place in 2558. So the implications that this could be are very, very big. And before we get on to that, though, I think there's one last thing I kind of wanted to talk about, which was the introduction of the Flood in a DLC, Awakening the Nightmare. Now, the Flood is an enemy that, again, was actually now in both Halo Wars games, and the coming of the Flood in Halo Wars 2 is from none other than something that, again, fans from Halo 3 will be very familiar with, which is the destruction or the destroyed High Charity on the Ark. And within the Awakening the Nightmare DLC, we see the reintroduction of the Flood, and we see the two commanders, or at least the two new commanders that Atriox is doing, or Atriox is over, which is Pavium and Vidoris. And Vidoris and Pavium managed to cause a flood outbreak by investigating the quarantined shield protecting High Charity and going inside, which caused eventually a flood outbreak, as I was mentioning a moment ago, that is also contained by them, luckily, with a proto-gravemind, similar to what we start seeing in Halo CE with Captain Keyes being taken. And this gargantuan-sized proto-gravemind, if it was allowed to finish growing, would have made the flood in the local area pretty much unstoppable due to its nature and the hive-like mind nature of the flood. I would say, fortunately, which I am going to go with that, the flood was stopped before it could go too far, and the proto-gravemind was killed in time for Atriox to arrive and inspect the scene himself, and scolds the two brothers before ordering them to, secure it, with himself kind of inspecting the remains of the proto-gravemind, and the Sentinels also going to clean up. So that in itself is kind of something that I wanted to bring up again, just kind of before we talked about the implications of the ending, because now having the Flood on the Lesser Ark from Halo 3 is also something we should take into consideration when now looking forward to, where we're at in the timeline and what could possibly be in the future, which is what we might see with either this last book of, Smoke and Shadow and Renegades, the third of that trilogy, or even Halo Infinite, Noah, if you wanted to take that away.
Yeah, so Halo Wars as a whole has a lot of important impacts on the Halo universe, as we were saying, and of course with that Awakening the Nightmare DLC, we see the return of that infamous enemy, and that's really important too, because not only does it show that it reminds us, I should say, actually, that the Flood are still out there, they're still a threat. The victory that we got in Halo 3 wasn't totally perfect. There's still Flood specimen on various different, Forerunner installations or even the Ark, as we see. And so this is important to consider because we could see the Flood return, which is, in my opinion, the Flood are kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that they're part of some of the most infamous missions in Halo, the Library or Cortana. But at the same time, you also have them involved in the best mission in all of Halo, which is Halo and Halo 3. And so it's an interesting thing to consider, and especially it's an interesting thing to consider them back as a enemy faction because, we've been talking about that a lot, how if you're familiar with the lore, you would understand that the Covenant are gone. They're dead. There's very little of them left. We would likely not see the traditional Covenant back as an enemy faction. So who would there be to fill their shoes in a sense? Well, it could potentially be the Flood in part, and that's important just because how well not only could we see the Flood in that sense, but we've actually proven with the Awakening the Nightmare DLC that the Flood could be done within a T for teen rated space, which is of course a trend that was set by Halo 5, going back and having the games rated T now. So we've seen that they're capable of doing T for teen Flood. So that's no longer off the table if we get the news that Halo Infinite is going to be rated T. So that's really interesting.
I find that to be something that's great as well because if I remember correctly, Halo Wars 1 was also T for teen rated. And they did an amazing job of having the Flood within the game. I mean, I still felt like the Flood were exactly like how they were before, but now shifting over more into the Infinite and the future of the timeline and what could possibly happen, I kind of wanted to touch on a quick topic that I had mentioned in one of my YouTube videos, which was what Cortana might be thinking with now the Flood as an enemy and using, as we've seen in both the Halo Wars 2 ending and in Halo 5, the Guardians as her enforcers throughout the galaxy. Clearly, there must be some reason for Cortana to be taking over this Halo ring or wanting control over this Halo ring. However, if you watch my video, Cortana, might be wanting to use the Halo array, and without also spoiling all of that, because I definitely recommend you guys check that out for further detail on this theory. That she currently is withholding the mantle of responsibility, if you guys know what that is, which kind of is a guardianship of over all living things in the galaxy. And to use the Halo array would be kind of against that principle, but yet for some reason we still see that she wants control over the Halo rings. And in that video, I proposed my theory of similar to the Didact, which who also was very close to the idea of the mantle of responsibility, could have her own reasoning for wanting to use that Halo. And I won't spoil it here because I definitely recommend you guys check out that in-depth theory on the video, but it would be definitely something to consider that if she had control over the Halo array, or possibly even worse, the Arc, which is actually outside of the effects of the Halo array, could send some big implications. In fact, Noah, I know you read the books New Blood and Bad Blood that kind of showed, I think, the furthest along in the Halo timeline that we've seen thus far through any Halo media, if you kind of wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, and so we understand that Cortana is in control of a majority of systems and that she's planning something, but we still don't know exactly what, which will potentially be revealed soon in some further media. However, we do understand that her army of guardians is rather limited, so the fact that she would send one guardian to this specific Halo ring that Anders is on is extremely important to consider. And not only that, but we also have to consider that Cortana and her created faction might end up being a sort of enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of scenario with the Flood, just because I doubt that they would, sort of ally in a sense, because that would really make no sense. So they would likely have hostilities if we are to see a large-scale return of the Flood faction within Halo Infinite.
Well, again, the last thing I think I'd want to talk about is, with so many factions and whatnot, what do you think about the possibility of a new Halo Wars game, or maybe what the Spirit of Fire will be doing or have any part to play in Halo Infinite, or, if they're gonna, if you think maybe they're gonna come out with a whole Halo Wars 3, how that might turn out. And this is just speculation entirely, no, right or wrong answers here.
Yeah. Yeah, I would personally love to see some of the Spirit of Fire crew within Halo Infinite. I think the most likely candidate is obviously Anders, just due to what we know and due to that cutscene. However, I would love to see either Cutter and the ship in some sort of supportive role, or potentially, we reuniting with Red Team in a way, because this is a very grave threat that the galaxy is under. I kind of compared it to like a Mass Effect 3 scenario in which the galaxy's really in trouble because of Cortana's threat. And not only that, but I think the Halo Wars games really showed that these spin-off titles within Halo universe work, and there's something that people enjoy, and they can have the depth of a mainline game without having the same gameplay or sort of level design that you're traditionally used to. And I think the RTS format was a really good choice for Halo Wars because it gave you the opportunity to kind of live out some of those fantasies you might have had, staging these large scale battles within an amazing sci-fi universe of Halo. And so that's something to consider going forward as well. Potentially, we'll see. I would love to see a Halo Wars 3, of course. I think that their story, the Spirit of Fire story, crew isn't done yet, so we'll likely see that. But I would love to see more spin-off titles in general as well.
So, and again, as you're saying, with the large scale battles, I mean, Halo Reach tried to do some justice with like the introduction of the level and the tip of the spear. I think that originally, if you kind of know the history of Halo Combat Evolved or Halo in general, you would know that it started off as an RTS game and then went to a third person and a first person. So, kind of going back to what Halo was originally meant to be when it was developed is something that's kind of really cool to consider when you're playing Halo Wars and Halo Wars 2. But unfortunately, it looks like we're running out of time. So, Noah, if there's anything else you wanted to mention before we decided to wrap this up?
Nope, I think we're good.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for listening on this podcast. I really appreciate it. Make sure to come on every Wednesday to check out our next podcast. I think we'll be talking about Hunt the Truth on that one. So that one's going to be a good one with myself, Matt, and Noah. Also, make sure to check out my video releases every Sunday. And also, we just started a new Discord. Feel free to check in the link for the description below to jump in on that for my custom game nights every Saturday night and Sunday from 12 to 3. Saturday night, I believe, will be from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. So make sure to check those out. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.